Hi. Hello, my name is David McDowell Blue. I am a playwright, and I have written adaptations of Dracula as well as Carmilla. My talk today is about, Carmilla through a modern lens. I'm recording it because my internet is often far too wonky for words. But to continue or begin. Since 2011, there have been 4 motion pictures, 1 web series, and more than half a dozen stage adaptations of Carmilla, as well as 4 graphic novel versions and at least 3 audio dramas. With so many adaptations, however, emerges even more fodder for the question of how to adapt a story written in 1870 for the world of 2023, especially given the subject matter. I believe this really comes down to context. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, after all, was a man of his time, and while not one to really write polemics or preach in his writing, he lived in an era we would go profoundly homophobic, even though that did not even exist at that time. In fact, the word lesbian had only just begun to sometimes mean what we think of it as meaning. So the prejudices, conscious and unconscious, of that time permeates Le Fanu's work on some level, just as the prejudices of our own cannot help but color how we see his writings, especially this one. Hence a certain amount of distortion in both directions. Here's a concrete example. The story of Laura and Carmilla takes place in the Ottoman Empire 1800s. I would argue internal clues that is the 8th. Carmilla was first published in 1871. The English world thought accurately. A police state, one lacking any liberties of which England and her colonies felt so very proud. Now, that introduces a shade of envy, not immediately obvious, because without that detail, then the vampire hunters are not active servants of tyranny. And that's a pretty cool nuance. Now, this very point was addressed in the film Curse of Styria by shifting the time frame into the late 1980s and the location into the other side of the Iron Curtain. Likewise, in my own first play version, which is called Carmilla, play in 1 act, blatant plug, I placed the whole story smack dab in the middle of the Third Reich. And I defend that. Yet we have other issues to address. There's the appalling, horrible notion, the image of lesbians as predators, corrupters of innocent youth. Now, I would argue too much can be made of this notion in terms of the original context for a variety of reasons. Among other things, readers in the 1870s simply did not carry with them the same kinds of prejudices that became common by, for example, 1910, nor did they have the same concept of sexual orientation as we do. Yet, today, in 2023, we cannot escape our own context. It's just not possible, regardless of what Le Fanu may or may not have intended. His story is one being read and interpreted by a modern audience. More specifically, and herein lies the rub, part of that audience feel this story on a very personal level. After a century and a half of tropes, wherein women who love women routinely come across as either diabolical or tragically broken or doomed, sometimes both. And it is ridiculously easy to see Carmilla in those terms. One can see how this comes across as problematical. Homosexual lover proves inhuman, a living dead thing overwhelming the will of a naive child to slake their personal lust on someone who neither wants nor understands what this creature intends. I might well argue this is a simplistic way to read the text, but even if I'm right, this is also an obvious and clear-cut way to do so. That is not a good thing. So what do you do with this narrative? The bare bones comes across as very homophobic, after all. Yet there is something more to it, which has generated a very positive response in many an audience members who seem to be the target of that very prejudice inherent in the story. And that bears repeating. Here we have a story which seems to demonize lesbians, yet to which many lesbians respond positively. Why? Well, one answer, better to be a monster than a victim, seems legit, not least because it feeds into a built-up rage in many for having been victims of persecution. Nearly every gay individual I've ever known, or once I got to know them well enough to learn, had been physically assaulted for their sexual orientation. Think about that for a second or three. Yeah, cannot we all understand that bit of wish fulfillment, at least on some level? Turning the tables, being too powerful for anyone to dare try that. Likewise, being swept away by a mysterious older lover is the stuff of some sexual fantasies. Doesn't mean you would actually jump at the chance in real life, although, hey, sometimes you do whatever. But sexual fantasies, are by very nature primitive and form just one, albeit a perfectly valid and healthy part, just one part of our sexuality. There's nothing wrong with having those fantasies or exploring them. Here's another answer. Targets of persecution often feel a certain empathy with one another, with their fellow victims of a rigid status quo. The vampire is literally hunted by the entire world. Torch-wielding peasants and expert warriors in equal measure, both backed up by religious institutions which oppress women and anyone even slightly queer, often with extreme prejudice. So, hey, the enemy of my enemy. But this barely addresses the narrative of a predatory lesbian who is literally a monster out to corrupt a still teenage virgin. How does one subvert that? And make no mistake, I'm urging, we do subvert it. Regardless of whether Lefanu meant to convey that kind of narrative, that's how it comes across today, promoting a grotesque set of lies. I'm going to list some possibilities. Feel free to use them or not, or come up with your own. More importantly, I want to note how these possibilities subvert the homophobic narrative. To start, what if there are other gay characters? Look at the Canadian web series Carmilla, which did this with a vengeance. Laura, rather than being a bashful innocent, is an eager college student looking for a girlfriend. She has an overprotective love interest, Danny, and among her best friends is a non-binary student in a not quite romantic yet relationship with their best friend, who's about as femme as one could ask for. The fact the vampire is gay just makes her one of many. Now, note part of what makes this work. In this scenario, Laura knows her own mind, is not being seduced by someone so much wilier than she herself could ever hope to be. Rather, she herself has a strong identity and makes her own choices. And because there are many gay people, the fact that the vampire doesn't stick out. Now, the web series also did another trick in subverting the narrative, making Carmilla herself a reluctant vampire. She is the victim of someone else, of far greater power and, more important, cruelty. Indeed, the web series iteration of the title character isn't even seeking to bite Laura. Rather, she finds herself with surprising and deep romantic feelings for this otherwise irritating young woman. And as a result, this young woman who is so naive is full of what Carmilla herself wishes she still felt: hope. And given how much time the web series was able to devote to this whole story, small wonder they managed to entwine all of it with so much nuance, including a nicely complex redemption arc for Carmilla. Now, the Hammer Studios film in 1970, The Vampire Lovers, did something similar, portraying Ingrid Pitt's version of the character as reluctantly under the sway of a mysterious man in black. Of course, this didn't mitigate homophobia very much, and did so by removing agency from the title character. So yeah, still quite problematical. Now, the aforementioned Curse of Styria took another path. In that film, we are treated to the image of the vampire as a suppressed female power emerging in and twisted vengeance. Ooh, that's interesting. Also, the Spielsdorf character comes across as an unalloyed villain. Carmilla, an avatar of rage-filled reaction to his crimes and those of his kind. Similar idea was in both The Unwanted in 2014, written and directed by Brett Wood, and the 2019 film Carmilla by Damley Harris, which had the interesting twist in that neither version is it at all clear that Carmilla is a vampire, in which case the vampire hunters become unmitigated villains and human monsters. My own versions did something similar with this, not least highlighting that a vampire must drink blood to survive. Humans, on the other hand, do not, in fact, have to wage war. They don't have to persecute minorities or murder dissidents. They don't have to commit genocide or other atrocities. Vampires have no choice, but humans do. And between the two, which one does the most harm? Now, granted, that one is a tad subtle, and you have to really punch a lot of buttons to make it work. Plus, and this is personal experience speaking, you're not real careful, some folks simply will not get it. And then, you can say that about almost anything. Now, how about this idea? What if we change the nature of the vampires? What if, for example, they never have to kill in order to survive? The web series touched on this. Carmilla did not need to kill, although she seems a bit nicer in that regard than other vampires. There was also a rather anemic vampire detective series called Moonlight, lasted one season. The example shows an inherent problem with this idea, which is where's the internal conflict to being a vampire if there's really no downside? There's not, especially not even any moral downside. But it does help dovetail the whole make the vampire hunters evil trope. I very strongly suggest making Laura and Carmilla a genuine non-toxic love story. This is tricky, not least because as a vampire, Carmilla is supposed to be at least 2 centuries old. So the age gap has a problem, but there are ways around this, not least how about having our vampires stuck emotionally at their age when turned. Yeah, this is the Twilight solution, but valid. Then there's also the Dark Shadows solution. Carmilla has been asleep for a really long time. So in terms of actual experiencing time in life, she's much closer to Laura's age. True Blood did another one. This one, let's switch out Carmilla for Bill. Carmilla has grown weary, longs to change, to become someone else, someone new. And all of these variations pretty much require a much higher degree of strength and maturity from Laura, who is frankly all too often treated as little more than an ingenue-shaped prop. You can also take the traditional shortcut of having Laura be the reincarnation of Carmilla's long-lost love. We can call that the Bram Stoker's Dracula solution or the mummy solution, which has become a bit of a cliche, but it could still work. You could also possibly just play the whole thing as the darkest of dark comedies, i.e. embracing all the problematical parts of the story with a great big bear hug. This is very tricky, in my opinion. Now, vampire comedies usually, pardon the pun, suck. But as love at first bite, as well as What We Do in the Shadows go through, they can work. This idea would mean, diving into all the vampire tropes in the original story, then showing them as silly in one way or another, or at least funny. Mocking ideas without necessarily mocking people, or laughing at stereotypes without in any way encouraging them, playing up humor about lesbians and vampire lesbians without at the same time heaping scorn on folks you don't want to do that to. It's not an easy balance to achieve. In my mind's eye, I do savor the possibilities while finding the actual thought of writing the damn thing daunting. It's just, here is one I haven't seen. Let a gay woman rescue Laura from the vampire. Rather than a bunch of withered old men gathering in a committee and executing Carmilla away from our narrator's delicate sensibilities, how about someone else actively rescue our heroine? Someone who is not a straight man, but a gay woman. So many versions introduce a suitably young male lead to do the rescuing of Laura, which of course strengthens all the implications of homophobia. You're rescuing someone from homosexuality, whatever. By transforming this character into another woman, one short circuits that whole trope, or at least turns it around. Offhand, I can't think of any version that does this, so the idea is totally up. Perhaps go for it. A word of warning: many versions which do have a love interest for Laura introduced other than Carmilla, in that process, Laura herself often loses much of her agency and even personality. If, as so often happens, unfortunately, a female character is given a traditional male role and then turns out to be nothing more than a male character, but with breasts, this is very likely to happen. Try to avoid that one. That one's a great big trap just waiting to fall into. Now, the motion picture The Moth Diaries, which was clearly and openly pretty much inspired by Carmilla to some degree, did a melancholy version of this. In it, our narrator is pretty much in love with her roommate at a boarding school. And this mysterious new student begins to woo her away. Said new student turns out to be a vampire, and the roommate ultimately succumbs. Our narrator finally learns enough, gathers enough lore, gathers her courage to put that vampire down with at least some sense of pity. She is putting this vampire out of her misery, after all. But in terms of this discussion, then, to be lesbian is not to be powerless or corrupt, but simply to be human. No, please feel free to mix and match as you see fit. Absolutely, throw in your own stuff. It's all up for grabs, and I think there's a lot of great possibilities. And we have 200 versions of Dracula. We certainly could do with another 100 versions of Carmilla. I do want to emphasize the profound way one needs to do to retell this tale well. Contrary to what all the books and half the teachers claim, story structure is only a tool. It is to be used and then discarded based entirely on need. We will most feel and experience any new version of Carmilla, no matter what the medium, when you have succeeded in making the characters as real and as complex as our own hopes and fears, our secret desires and deepest regrets. Those contradictory polarities which make up real people. We are cruel and the obvious bigotry in this story, or at least the story lends itself to it, is more than a worthwhile goal. It is highly admirable. But if you don't also make us look at these characters and feel, without necessarily thinking this, oh, yes, that is me in another time and in another situation, but still me, then I have my doubts you've succeeded in showing us a Carmilla through a modern lens. Thank you.